My dream started in New York City. I had lived in New Delhi, India, where my husband and I had adopted 3 orphan children, one of whom was mentally disabled. We moved to the Upper West Side of Manhattan. My husband worked for a nonprofit and didn't get paid enough to pay the bills to live in New York. And it was like, okay, how can I help? Well, I was trained as a musician, and when I graduated from college, I taught school for 1 year and had a headache every single day. I said, there has to be another way to make a living. I cannot do this. Now, I first thought it was because that I was teaching something I loved, music, to people who didn't want to learn it. But I subsequently learned through my entrepreneurial journey that the real issue was that when you're teaching, you know what you are going to do every hour of the day for 9 months. Well, if you have an entrepreneurial spirit, that's like just throw you in prison. I mean, I don't know what I'm doing 3 minutes from now, let alone 9 months from now, and I love it that way. That's the way it works. So teaching obviously was not an option. So I decided, growing up on a farm in Nebraska, I watched my father invent things all the time. He could never afford what he needed, and he'd go to the junk pile and pull out wire and things and make things. He was always creating things. I remember he dug terraces by hand, and his neighbors thought he was crazy. But it turned out to be exactly the right thing to do. So I sat on the playground at Riverside Park with my children, and I heard people say, we haven't eaten off the table in a month because it's all piled full of papers. How many of you have heard something like that? Yeah. You know, I had to file an extension on my income taxes. We're getting to that time now. It's like, oh, I can't find all the receipts I need. Or, you know, I'm fighting with my husband about the clutter on the counter, or my kids about their cluttered room. And I thought, you know, this is a problem that I know how to solve. Now, I don't know how to solve it because I'm naturally organized. Those of you who've been around me a long time know that nothing could be farther from the truth. But I grew up on the second floor of a tenant farmhouse in Nebraska. My parents had 13 cents the day I was born. There were only 3 rooms. There was 4 of us. We didn't have any running water, and there wasn't a lot of space. The only space I had was a little chest of drawer at a closet and a chest of drawers that my father built me. I can see it today so clearly. And my mother worked at a jewelry store, and she would bring home the jewelry boxes that were slightly bent that the jewelry store couldn't use. And I spent my time putting those boxes in that little chest, trying to figure out how to get all my belongings in that small space. And my mother, our house was sometimes cluttered because there were 4 of us in space, but if the phone rang and the preacher was coming, we could get everything away really quickly. And we didn't stuff it. It had a place because there wasn't anything to have other than a place. One of the questions that some of you have heard me ask you is, what were you doing when you were 9, 10, and 11 years old? How many of you have heard me ask that question? And when I first ask it, you look at me and it's like, huh? But you know, that's a real clue. Because it's a clue about what God intended you to do it before somebody said, well, you can never make a living doing that. My husband tells the story that his mother tells the story that for his 12th birthday, he wanted the Wall Street Journal. My husband is one of the most brilliant money managers I've ever met. When everyone else is losing money, he's making it because that was what he was wired to do. So as I was sitting on the playground, I was thinking about all these issues of people having it, and I took $7 out of the grocery money, which was a big deal because I used to walk 20 blocks because I didn't have the 50 cents to get on the bus. That was part of it. I have to admit, I was thinking about it the other day, that part of it also was, and Casey will chuckle when she hears this, because the other reason I did that was because I was embarrassed to ask the bus driver whether that was the right bus. Because I hated the fact that I was a Nebraska farm girl and I was in New York and I didn't want to look like a hayseed. It took me a long time to figure that out. And when I started working with Casey, one of the first things I learned from her was I was scared to ask questions because I didn't want to look stupid. You can't be a successful entrepreneur if you don't ask questions. And if I had one thing to learn over, well, there's lots of things, but one of the first one was don't be afraid to ask questions. So that's what I want you to do while you're here. That's what those index cards are for. If there's a question you want answered, put it on that index card. And we may not answer it right now, but we'll get it answered. We take it seriously that you're here. Well, I put that ad in the paper. It said, organizing consultant can help you make better use of time and space. Well, like a lot of entrepreneurs, I got off to a rough start. 3 crank calls, guys calling me, trying to get... And the 4th call was from a widow, 58 years old, whose husband was an attorney. And like the shoemaker's kids with no shoes, it was the attorney who died without his own affairs in good order. He was at the desk at house looked like many of those desks that you guys have been organizing for years. The one at the office looked the same thing, and his wife knew nothing about anything about affairs because he'd always done such a good job of taking care of her. And suddenly he was gone, and they didn't have any children. So in a way, I kind of did the role of what a daughter would have done. I charged $10 an hour. And lived in horror that someone was going to say, what makes you think you're worth $10 an hour? I didn't tell her she was my first client. She didn't care. And when I first looked at it, I was like, oh my gosh, I don't know how to do this. And I thought, well, some things I know how to do. So I'm just going to start with what I know how to do. So I started going through the piles and, okay, I can talk to the insurance agent about this and the stockbroker about this and the accountant about this, and I just kept sorting. And that's the way the business started. I would go to PTAs or garden clubs or church clubs, anybody that would give me the platform, and I would give them 10 ways to organize your kids, 10 ways to get organized for Christmas, whatever it was. Well, my husband got transferred to Washington, D.C. So I was like, okay, start over again. How many of you have had to start over again? How many of you are facing starting over again? Entrepreneurship is about reinventing yourself over and over and over again. So I moved to Washington, and there was a magazine there called The Washingtonian. Those of you who are from Virginia and Washington, glossy, gorgeous magazine. And I knew that the people who read it had money. Now, at that point in time, I suffered from one of the symptoms that many of the people here have suffered from at various points. It's like I thought that having a successful business meant going to where the money was. In fact, I had a conversation last week with one of our consultants who's not here right now, and she said, we were talking about her target market. And she said, well, my target market's going to be lawyers. And I said, do you like hanging out with lawyers? I kind of looked at the look on her face and could see that really wasn't true. And there was this kind of long pause. And she said, well, not really. Then I said, that's not your target market. Because your target market is hanging out with people you like to hang out with. And some of you in this room I've been hanging out with for years, and I love it. Well, in any event, I saw the Washingtonian. Ann Zimmerman was the editor. I called her, made a cold call on the phone, said, I just moved here from New York City, and I have a service I think would be of interest to your readers. She listened to my story for 45 minutes and said, I'd like to do a story. I want to send a photographer. And they sent a photographer to my office, and they took a picture of me sitting on a filing cabinet and said that for $10 an hour, there was a section called Best Buys, and it said for $10 an hour, you could get Barbara Hemphill to come into your house and organize your filing system. Well, that was my start, and one of my very first clients was Jean Wiener Bell. Jean Wiener Bell had been traveled all over the world, She lived in this gorgeous mansion. She had lots and lots of stuff. But she also owned a PR company. And she helped me design my very first brochure. You can't see it from here, but if you want to see something funny, just come up and look at my picture. Shortly after I moved, I was thinking that my world was all together. We'd moved into a house in Northern Virginia. I remember calling my mother and saying, we just moved into a house that I can live in for the rest of my life. The sinks are shell-shaped. And my daughter with special needs had gotten into a school. She was doing really well. I had this little organizing business that was making a few $100s a month. It was just enough to subsidize my husband's income. I remember being in an airplane over St. Louis and looking out, and the sky was blue and the clouds were fluffy, and I'm thinking, wow, this is my year. And 30 days later, my marriage crashed. No one in my family had ever been divorced. I was ashamed and embarrassed and scared. And I didn't really know what to do. I went to a counselor. And she said to me, all right, Barbara, you have a blank slate. What do you want? I said, I don't really know. I said I was Mrs. Tom, and I liked being Mrs. Tom. I thought that was my life. That was what I really intended to do. And she made a statement that was life-changing, and which is very much responsible for why you are all here in this room. And that statement was, let's start with what you don't want. So I started with, well, I don't want to have a relationship of animosity with my ex-husband. I don't want to lose my relationship with my children. I don't want to be broke. I don't want to be sad. And so we began moving forward. For 20 years, I helped people organize physical and paper clutter. That was where Taming the Paper Tiger came from. It came because as I began to work in people's houses, the question that people always asked me was, how long do you keep? And in the 80s, the question that was really a big one was bank statements. Because they were big and thick and bulky, and they had lots of numbers on them. And it's like, okay, I've got to hang on to this. So people had boxes of them that they put in the closets and under the bed and in the attics and the garage. And so clients would say to me, how long do you keep those? And I'm thinking, I really don't know. So I went to the library and borrowed a book called, I went to the library to get a book on the subject, and there wasn't one. I thought, now this is amazing. Because it doesn't make any difference if you earn $18,000 a year or $800,000 a year. You still need to know the answer to the question, how long do you keep these things? So I went back to the library and I borrowed a book by Michael Larson, whom I met many years ago, and thanked him profusely for helping me launch my career, called How to Write a Book Proposal. Here's an interesting little statistic. Research shows that 80% of the population has given thought to wanting to write a book. How many of you in this room have ever thought about writing a book? There you go. The number that do, of course, is very slim. And if writing a book is something you want to do, please put that on your card, because we'd like to help you make that happen. I'm living proof that it can. So I decided I would write a book. I read the proposal. I read the book about how to write a proposal. I wrote the proposal. One of my clients happened to be in the publishing industry. I wasn't really asking her to help me publish it because I didn't have the nerve to ask that. But I just wanted to say, what do I do with it? I've written this proposal, but I don't have any idea what to do with it. She said, tell me about it. And so I did, and she said, I think my publisher would be interested. I said, really? So I flew to New York, and I went to Madison Avenue, and I went and had a meeting, and I came out with a $10,000 advance to write a book. I was floored. That was the beginning of Taming the Paper Tiger, which was published in 1988. The good news, it was excerpted immediately in Reader's Digest all over the world. That's the good news. The bad news was, at the same time that happened, the publisher declared bankruptcy, and my book was nowhere to be found. And to this day, I will meet people that say, I saw that article and I tried to buy the book and could not find it. So then I had to go back and figure out what I'm going to do now, and the publishing company owned the rights to the book. So in order for me to get my book back, I had to buy it back. I borrowed money from the bank, bought my book back, then I figured out, now I had to figure out how to pay the bank back. There was at that time a catalog called Viking Office Supply, and on the front of it was a picture of Mr. Irwin Helford. And it said on there, if you buy $100 worth of office products, we will send you a clock. I thought, now wait a minute. If he's buying clocks to give away to his customers, why wouldn't he buy my book? Because my book talks about the things that he's selling. He was in California, and this was the ways before answering machines and all those things that keep people away. And I knew that if you called an executive early in the morning, there was a good chance you'd get him because his secretary wouldn't be there yet. And that's exactly what happened. I kept calling, and I got Mr. Helford on the phone. I said, Mr. Helford, my name is Barbara Hemphill, and I have written a book that talks about the products that you sell. And I see that you give clocks to people who buy products. Why wouldn't you give them my book? Because it will make them want to buy more products. He said, well, I need for you to talk to so-and-so, and I did, and I ended up selling 37,000 copies. 27,000, oh, it's a number, sorry. 27,000 copies of that book. So I took the purchase order from them and went to the bank and borrowed money to print 35,000 copies of the book, so that they would have theirs and I would have some left over. That was when I became the Paper Tiger Lady. I tried to shed that title for a while, but I've learned that it's still a brand. The power of the brand is amazing. I'll go places and people will introduce me as she's the Paper Tiger Lady. So it helps to have a brand, and that was what started that process for me. So for 20 years, I focused on paper and physical clutter, and then I moved into digital clutter. Didn't want to. Didn't really like it. But, you know, if you have an audience you want to serve, you have to provide what it is that they want. And they kept saying, okay, we've organized our paper. We can find anything we file in 5 seconds or less if it's paper. But digital, that's a whole other thing. And so I moved into digital. Brought a lot of people with me, and there's a lot of those people in the room now that when my clients call me and they want help with digital, it's not yours truly who does it, it's the people in the room who do that. Together we are better. But in recent years, I've learned that the clutter that truly prevents people from accomplishing their work and enjoying their lives is spiritual and emotional. My company's called Productive Environment Institute. That's a very intentional name. I'm all about productivity, and I'm all about the environment, and I'm all about learning. So Productive Environment Institute embodies that. But the key is your environment is everywhere. It's your clothes closet. When you get up in the morning and you go to get dressed and you can't find that favorite suit that you want to choose to go with that suit, that's not a productive environment. In fact, I've written an article called How to Make Your Clothes Closet a Productive Environment. It is my most requested handout. And actually, the clothes closet is where all of this started. because the 4 words that have embodied my business is that clutter is postponed decisions. I learned that from clothes closets. Clothes closets fill up because you have not decided yet whether you're going to lose the 10 pounds you need to lose to get back into that suit you love so much, or what to do about that exercise equipment. It looked great on the shopping network, but been a long time since that's been out of the closet. And then there's the candlesticks you got from Aunt Sally. You know, you love Aunt Sally. I mean, she is such a dear, but those candlesticks are not really your style. But if she came for Thanksgiving dinner, she would love it if they were on the table, assuming you could find them, of course. Well, the same thing's true of paper. You look at that pile of paper on your kitchen counter, on your desk, the box that you moved from 3 moves ago that you haven't done anything with, and you say, okay, today's the day I'm going to clean up this paper, and you pick up the first piece of paper and look at it and think of any number of reasons why today is not a good day to deal with this piece of paper. And you pick up the second. Nope, don't think so. Third, fourth, before you know it, the pile that was on this side is on this side, and goodness gracious, I have something else I have to do. The same thing's true with email. Sit down in the morning, open, close, open, close, open, close, open, close, and before you know it, 45 minutes have gone by and nothing has happened except that your spirit has kind of sunk because you realize how far behind you are. Clutter is postponed decisions. Remember when that therapist said to me, start with what you don't want? Well, often when we go in to work with clients, one of the things is they feel really overwhelmed. And so we're helping them to start with what they don't want. And we have to do the same thing in the environment of our brain. If as an entrepreneur your brain is full of, that's too late, or that's too old, that's too expensive, I can't do that, I shouldn't have done that, that will never work, that is not an environment in which you will accomplish your work or enjoy your life. I believe that God created each and every one of us for a very specific role. And that when we do that role, nothing will stop us except ourselves. Often, I've found in working with many of you, it's difficult to figure out what that is. That's what target market is all about. In the organizing productivity industry especially, people said, but everybody needs what we do. That's true. They do. But they need a different part of what you do, delivered in a different way. When in June of last year, I was having a conversation on the telephone with my long-term friend and colleague, Louise Wanier. Some of you in the room know her because we worked with her when we were working with Taming the Paper Tiger, organizing paper, and she was working with a program called NFISH, organizing digital information, and we worked together, and we become fast friends. And I was having a conversation with her, and I said to her, you know, Louise, I want to write this book. There's a book that I want to be my legacy. In the 37 years I've been doing this, there are a series of principles, starting with Clutter's Postponed Decisions and ending with Together We Are Better, which are timeless. They will be just as true 200 years from now as they are now. And I want to get those principles into a book. And she said, well, you have the condo at Carolina Beach. Why don't you just go to condo and hole yourself up for a couple weeks and write it? I said, I can't do that. She said, why not? I said, because this is not a how-to book. I've written the how-to books. Organizing paper at home, what to toss and how to find the rest. If you read that book from beginning to end and you do it, it works. We have thousands of people who've told us that. But this book is a why-to book. So she said, tell me what the book looks like. I said, well, it's 6 inches square. It's less than a half inch thick. It has more white space than print, and you can read it in less than an hour. She said, well, look at the book and tell me, what does it look like? Or how does it make you feel? I stopped for a minute, and I said, peaceful. She said, okay, open up the page. Tell me, what does this make you feel? I said, hopeful. She said, turn to another page. Tell me what it makes you feel. I said, energetic. She said, why don't you fly out to Pasadena to my studio and let's write it? Because I had said the reason I was writing a Y2 book was it had to have art, because it had to touch the heart. It had to touch the emotions, and it needed art in order to do that. So when she said, why don't you fly out to my studio and write the book? I said, are you kidding? She said, no. I said, well, what's your calendar look like in July? And she said, I'm free July 21st, 22nd, and 23rd. And I looked at my calendar, and so was I. It was the only 3 days in July I could have flown to California. And not only that, but Judy was here, and I was taking her to the airport on the 20th, which meant I drove to the airport. Judy went that way, and I went that way. I knew God was at work. The result of those 4 days was this book. If I die tomorrow, I believe this is the reason I was put on earth. And I was put on earth to put these principles together so that you could understand them, so that you can apply them to your lives, so that you can figure out what your purpose on earth is, that you can get rid of the emotional clutter that prevents you from accomplishing your work and enjoying your life. And then you will do far greater things than I have done or will ever do. I read that in Google in January, in the how-to searches, how to declutter was number 14. There's an immense amount of discussion about decluttering these days. In fact, on the cover of the Wall Street Journal, the cult of tidying up. What is interesting to me is that most of the discussion around clutter relates to personal clutter. But it is my observation that business clutter is costing our world millions and millions and millions of dollars. And my passion is to connect with you, to help you identify what is the audience that you can connect with. And many of those are in businesses. I want to read a letter that one of our consultants got. This was a letter written not to me, but to one of the people that I've trained after they did a productive environment day. I cannot thank you enough for spending the day with us and helping us create a more productive environment. I could go on forever about how this has and will impact us. So allow me to bullet point here. Number one, it was a team building day. As a small business owner, that says plenty. To see your folks work together toward a common goal is a great thing. 2, the office feels lighter. So much stuff is gone, uncluttered. We've been here but a year, and we took out armloads of trash, not to mention shredding. 3, processes and delegation are smoother, and I don't feel like we have our tail feathers hanging out there so much. 4, from a compliance standpoint, perspective, holes have been filled. All of this, and to top it off, it was great fun. We have penciled in 2 of these events a year. I cannot begin to tell you how important it was. I would venture a guess that there isn't a company out there that couldn't use your services. One of my favorite authors is Mark Patterson. He's written a book called The Circle Maker. And in it he says, the greatest chapters in history always begin with risk. If you're unwilling to risk your reputation, you'll never build an ark like Noah or get out of the boat like Peter. You cannot build God's reputation if you're not willing to risk yours. Being an entrepreneur involves taking a risk. You took a risk to come here, but I promise you that God has a very specific intention for your life. As one of my friends put it, she struggled in many ways in her life, and I was talking to her on the phone the other day, and she said, I am determined. She planned to be here for this conference, and because of another commitment, she couldn't. But she said, I will be at the next one. She's a woman who actually won the lottery at one point and lost it all and ended up homeless. And now she's back on track. And she said, I am determined I will join you because I am an eagle. Eagles don't belong in snail shells. I thank you for coming today to take this risk, because I know that God has an intention for you. And it is my desire to do whatever we can to make that intention come true so you can accomplish your work and enjoy your life and empower others to do that personally and professionally. Thank you for coming.